De seguida, então, iremos ter a doutora An Renckens, que felizmente irá fazer a sua apresentação em inglês e não dispomos de tradução simultânea, mas creio que todos irão compreender a apresentação da doutora An Renckens. Mrs. An Renckens holds a PhD in Antwerp, I suppose. She's been working longly at the European Commission, and nowadays she works at the DG.com, where she's responsible for competition issues in food supply chain. As we are a friendly country, we imported from Brussels the weather in order for you to feel good today here in Portugal and not having our traditional sun. So I suppose you won't feel outside from Brussels nowadays in Portugal. So thank you for coming to Portugal and thank you for your presentation.
Thank you. Maybe it's easier if I switch to that seat so I can have... So thank you, Mr. President, for also for Centromarca for having invited the Food Task Force of DG Competition to this event, which is dealing with a very interesting but complicated and these days a very hot topic in various member states of the EU, but also at the EU level itself, namely how to deal with unfair commercial practices and imbalances in the relationships between different actors in the business-to-business food and non-food supply chain. I'm replacing Mr. Philippe Chauve, which is the head of unit of the Food Task Force in DG Competition. I'll do my best to replace him as good as possible and to answer your questions if you have them. Maybe two important points to mention before I start my presentation is that to understand a bit the angle of the presentation. So I'm working the Food Task for DG Competition, so what I discuss will mainly consider the food supply chain and look at the competition policy issues in there. So I will also not talk about the specific situations of unfair trading practices in various member states, but I'll focus on the EU initiatives and what projects are there now for dealing with the topic of restricted commercial practices. So to give you a bit of an overview, what are the topics I'll talk about? So I'll start with giving you a general introduction and as a kind of background, providing you general trends in the food sectors and how these also have been picked up by national competition authorities in their work and in their cases over the last 10 years. Then I'll shift to the EU level and I will present three main projects which all touch upon the relationships between different actors in the food supply chain, which is first the reform of the Common Agricultural Policy, which was ongoing last year. Then there are the various initiatives on unfair trading practices at EU level. And then if I have time in the end, I'll talk a bit about the study the Food Task Force, so the unit I'm working in, is currently doing. So let's start by looking at summarizing some main trends. A first category of trends are dealing with food prices, especially at the start of the economic and financial crisis in 2007-2008. The citizens and policymakers were especially worried about the high level of food prices and also the increased volatility. Related to that, there was also the issue of asymmetric price transmission that national competition authorities also observed in their cases, which means that if, for instance, the price of cereals would increase, the price of the bread for the end consumer would also increase, but the opposite situation would not hold. So if the price of cereal decreased, the price of bread would stay high. And this observation by some national competition authorities in some sectors and in some countries has led to some concerns on whether competition is really working very well at all stages of the food supply chain. And a second category of issues I've picked out is the concerns about buyer-supplier relationships in the food chain. These concerns mainly come from the fact that in many member states we've seen concentration of both retail chains and food manufacturers has been increasing over the last decades. And I brought some graphs based on data from Planet Retail and Euromonitor, which show two things. That first, okay, in many countries, indeed, concentration measured here by the HHI, the Heffindal-Hirschman Index, which is the sum of the square of markets shares of all the players in the market, is indeed very high and has remained high in various member states, but different situations occur depending on the member states. You've seen in Belgium, France, it's been high, but it has remained stable or even slightly decreasing over years, while in other countries, such as, for instance, I think Portugal is also on the slide, there's still a concentration of retail sector is still increasing. The same for the supply concentration. Often it's said big manufacturers have been getting more concentrated, but also here we have to be careful to draw general conclusions for the whole of Europe and for all sectors. So you can see on the slides I've put the example of cereals, where concentration is generally very high in all member states, while for ham, for example, there's more divergence, and there are really countries where concentration is lower, such as Italy, while Portugal and Spain appear to be in the higher concentration countries. So this just to say that, okay, concentration indeed for both retail side and supply side has been high, increasing, but we have to be careful to draw general conclusions. Now, despite these high levels of concentration of big retail groups, brand manufacturers, the primary level of the food supply chain, the agricultural sector, remains very atomized and very low concentrated. Also, we see that in the food sector, there are still many small and medium enterprises active. So in a situation where both these big and small companies have to interact and to work with each other, it's not so bizarre or awkward that tensions between these different parties exist. And these imbalances in bargaining power, as we call them, they might also lead to competition violations, such as foreclosure of competitors and unfair trading practices. Now, as I said before, the main concerns were a few years ago focused on prices. These days we see also a shift in concerns about the actual choice innovation for the end consumer due to the existence of unfair trading practices and imbalanced bargaining situations. To give you an example on how we look at this, try to quantify a bit the imbalances, we've computed a measure of imbalance, of overall market imbalance, based on the ratio of retail and supply concentrations, and which basically mean, it's not so clear maybe on the graph, but the zero line is perfect balance. Below the zero line, it means that the supply side of the market is more concentrated than the retail side, and the other way around for the positive part of the slide, where the retailers are more concentrated. And here again, you see that it's hard to draw very general conclusions for the whole of the EU and for all product categories, as, for instance, for cereals, the supply side seems to be more concentrated, more powerful than the retailers, while the opposite, again, it holds for ham. So just to say that we have to be careful with generalizing. Now, these trends discussed on previous slides have been recognized and investigated in some recent cases and reports by the national competition authorities. I will not go into the details of all their work, but if you want to learn more, there has been a report of the ECN, that's the European Competition Network subgroup on food, which has been published in May 2012 and provides an overview of all antitrust and competition activities of national competition authorities in the period 2004-2011. Just to give an example on what type of work they've been doing, so for instance in antitrust cases, like half of the infringements they found concerned horizontal agreements. For instance, the Italian NCA found that price coordination by pasta manufacturers in Italy over the period 2006-2009 has led to wholesale price increase of more than 50%, and which led to also more than 35 price increases at the retail level for the price of pasta. Not only cartels between manufacturers exist, they also pointed out that buyer cartels, for instance, in the sector of dairy, have been prevalent in many member states over this period. Then, more related to what we discussed today, so some hot topics that were covered in the market investigations of these NCAs was first the topic of asymmetric price transmission, which I talked before. So they found that while often it can be explained by some structural changes in the market, such as higher prices of inputs, labor or energy, higher costs, in many cases it was also due to weakened competition and even competition law infringements. Another very much investigated topic, also by the Portuguese Competition Authority, has been indeed the practices linked to the imbalances in the supply chain, and especially the focus has been between retailers and their suppliers, the food manufacturers. So this a bit to set the scene and to see what national competition authorities have been doing. Now I'll switch to the initiatives at EU level. The first one is where attention was given to imbalances between different actors in the food supply chain with the agricultural sector, with the reform of the Common Agricultural Policy, or CAP. Before I go into the details of the reform, why was the reform deemed necessary? First, in times of economic and financial crisis, where we come from or where we still in, it's sound to ask ourselves whether the EU budget is indeed spent well, and when we impose austerity measures to member states, it's also good where we can manage the EU budget better. And then, of course, the agricultural sector and the CAP, it's an eye-catcher, which, as it takes 40% of the EU budget goes to the farmers. So, from that perspective, it would be good that the farming sector would become more competitive and that they get better revenues by competing more. Then, secondly, there calls for reform also coming from the fact that climate and environmental issues have become more important in all sectors of the economy. So it's also logic that the agricultural sector is asked to put more effort into greening. Also, with the economy becoming more global and Europe importing many also agricultural products from the rest of the world, it's important that the European farmers can remain competitive and can compete with products coming from the rest of the world, and that they also can survive, can improve their incomes, their revenues, without relying only on the subsidies provided by member states and the EU. So that's some general background on why it was deemed necessary to reform this agricultural policy. Then about the content, so the position of the farmers, and more precisely their lack of bargaining power vis-à-vis their buyers, was at the heart of the recent reform of the CAP. And although this starting point was very clear to everyone, the negotiations between the European Parliament and the Council were very tough, and both had a different view on how to improve the position of the farmers. So according to the Parliament, the solution had to be found in a relaxing of EU competition rules for the agricultural sector. I will not go into the details of the Parliament proposal, but what they basically wanted was to create wide-ranging exemptions to competition rules and to make sure that farmers could get together, could engage in joint selling and fix prices without any limits. So where in fact, this cartel behavior, which is actually prohibited for all other sectors of the economy, and it's a very severe infringement of competition law, they just wanted to exempt the whole agricultural sector from this. This, of course, was not accepted by the Council and the Commission, who saw some problems with that. And therefore, they finally came to a compromise solution. So instead of relaxing the competition rules for the whole of the agricultural sector, only operators in the beef, olive oil, and arable crop sectors are now exempted from competition, and they may now engage in joint selling, which will effectively increase their bargaining power, or at least that's the purpose of this exemption, namely that farmers will get together, will group their forces, and will have a better bargaining position vis-à-vis their buyers. Now, of course, this is not without limit. This can only happen under certain conditions, which is the creation of efficiencies. So farmers, if they get together, they also will have to show that by getting together, they will reduce their costs or they obtain other advantages. And of course, this is only for farmers that don't reach certain market share ceilings. So the next step in the reform of the CAP will be that the Commission will publish guidelines, because of course for farmers it's hard to interpret what are these efficiencies, what type of efficiencies will be accepted, what is enough, etc. So guidelines will be published, and in this year the Commission will do a public consultation so that stakeholders from all sectors can express their views on these new rules and these new guidelines. So this is about the improving the bargaining position of farmers, so the first level of the food supply chain. Now, not only farmers, but as said, all actors at all levels of the food supply chain may be facing imbalanced relationships and unfair trading practices because of that. And therefore, the European Parliament had been calling for years already for actions to indeed better tackle unfair trading practices also at the EU level. And not only the Parliament has been asking that, but also we've been receiving complaints from both food manufacturers and consumer associations that because of these imbalanced situations, because of the application of unfair trading practices, it would lead to a risk to choice of products and incentives for companies to invest in R&D, and so it would reduce choice and innovation for the end consumer. So far we have not seen hard evidence of that, but I'll come back later to that with our retail study. We'll try to get a better view on this. So to what extent now any abuse of bargaining power in bilateral contractual relationships by applying these unfair trading practices should be regulated? It's a complicated issue, and it cannot necessarily or uniquely be solved by competition rules. The table is not so clear, I see on the slide. Something has shifted, but maybe you have printouts, you can see the difference between competition law and contract law. And as also recognized in EU law, Regulation 1 of 2003, there is indeed a clear demarcation between competition rules and unfair trading laws. So to summarize the table, so competition law deals only with practices that have an impact on the total working of the market. So not only between two competitors, but the whole sector has to be affected. Also, an effect on consumer welfare has to be shown. While for contract law, more fairness issues play also a role. More particular, the fair distribution of economic rents between different actors in the chain is an important benchmark to start intervention or not. So, for example, if a retailer can force a supplier to pay in goods at a lower price, but if this lower price is also passed on to the end consumer, then probably there's no harm to consumer welfare. If this only happens between one retailer and one supplier, there might be no effect on the overall market. So from competition point of view, this might not be an issue, while it can be from the point of view of unfair trading practices. This said, of course, you cannot read it, but there are situations where both competition law and unfair trading practice laws can be applied, like for instance for tying, which can be an unfair trading practice between two parties, but if applied by a dominant company, like was the case with Coca-Cola in a case some years ago, it might also be a competition issue. The fact that competition law is generally not the most appropriate tool to address unfair trading practices has also been the experience of some competition authorities. I think it's also mentioned in the report of the Portuguese Competition Authority of 2010 that it's often very hard to find the short-run impact of unfair trading practices on consumer welfare, so that it's hard to tackle the practice with competition rules. And therefore, instead, national competition authorities, like we hear today, the Portuguese Competition Authority as well, have been advocating the adoption or implementation of specific laws or codes of good practices in order to better deal with unfair trading practices. And as we'll hear in a bit later, the UK is, of course, in Europe a very popular example. And they changed their unfair trading practice rules by introducing the Grocery Supply Code of Practice. But also, as said, many other member states are active on this topic, like Portugal, for instance. Nevertheless, although it's hard to find often short-term impact, some competition authorities have been focusing on the long-term impact of unfair trading practices. Namely, they've been looking at the incentives for companies to invest in R&D and to develop new products. They have been shown that, for instance, the Finnish and the Spanish Competition Authority, in their reports, they've been looking very well at what might be the effects of unfair trading practices on companies' incentives to invest and put new products on the shelves. At the EU level, there are currently a number of initiatives ongoing, as you might know, which try to shed a light on the need to address and how to tackle unfair trading practices in the business-to-business relationships in the food and non-food supply chain. First of all, there's the high-level forum for a better functioning food supply chain, which was set up in 2010 and contains an expert platform on B2B contractual practices. The stakeholders, they launched a voluntary initiative to minimize the scope and existence of unfair trading practices in the area of food by agreeing on a code of good practices in 2011. and an implementation mechanism in 2012. Most stakeholders in the chain have agreed upon this code of good practices and the implementation mechanism, apart from the farmers. So Copa-Cogeca is still not happy with the initiatives presented in the high-level forum, but the dialogue is maintained, and they still hope to get them involved. Then, secondly, last year in January, the Commission launched and published a green paper on unfair trading practices, together with a public consultation, the purpose of which was to gather the public and stakeholders' opinion on what's exactly the scope of UTPs in Europe and how to best deal with them. And the input to this public consultation is currently assessed into through the impact assessment, which is ongoing and which will have to come out with proposals on whether, okay, we'll stick to just voluntary and self-regulatory initiatives, or should we go to issue recommendations or even go further and have harmonized rules and legislation at the EU level. This is ongoing, so I'm not able to tell more what the outcome will be. Then, I don't know whether I still have time. Okay, so I'll quickly then also touch upon our retail study and why we've been, oops, something went wrong with this slide. So the purpose here was to show you why we're doing the retail study. One of the main reasons we're doing is that it would serve as an input to the debate on unfair trading practices. Because in the Green Paper, there have been given two main reasons to intervene and to take action at EU level. First, there was the argument, as I said before, that UTPs affect businesses' capacities to invest in innovation and R&D, and hereby they affect the available choice of products on the shelves for the end consumer. And secondly, the fact that there are no harmonized rules and that every member state has its own rules on how to deal with unfair trading practices. This would affect cross-border trade and distribution, and as a consequence affect the working of the single market. Now, the retail study of DG Comp will basically will provide input to the first argument, because we think that's important before rushing into any regulation which might bring benefits but also some costs, has been shown in some member states. It's important to see whether the arguments put forward are really true. Is it really true that today choice and innovation in the area of food have been going down? We have seen partial reports, but no really factual empirical evidence which is showing that indeed choice and innovation have been deteriorating over the last years in the area of food. So therefore, the study intent is to provide some quantitative and empirical evidence on this topic. And the second reason, of course, is that we want to answer to the calls of the European Parliament, who wanted us already for years to check whether competition is really working in the food supply chain in Europe. So very quickly, what will we then do exactly? So first, on a descriptive side, we will look at the evolution of choice and innovation for a broad number of food product categories in Europe. And more importantly, we will not only describe the evolution, but also will try through an econometric study to assess what is driving this evolution. And we'll be considering two types of drivers. There's market-related circumstances, such as retail concentration, supply concentration, and some measure of imbalance, which can indeed affect choice innovation, or there are many other circumstantial factors, such as just the type of shop, the economic crisis, the successfulness of private labels in the countries. How important are these factors? And then if we see that choice innovation have been decreasing over time, but if it's mainly due to the fact that shop characteristics have changed or that socio-demographic parameters have changed, then this may for us not be economic reasons to call for intervention in the sector. I'll skip this one, it would lead us a bit too far. So to give you an idea of where we stand with this study, we launched it at the end of 2012, and we've chosen last year a consortium of 3 parties led by Ernst & Young and accompanied by Arcadia International and Cambridge Econometrics to do the study. They have started working over summer. We normally, initially the calendar had foreseen that we would have the final report by the end of this month. Fortunately, we had some data problems and problems to get really also at local level for different member states for a large number of product categories, enough data, so therefore there's some delay, and the public report will be is now expected to be available by the end of the second quarter of this year, so a couple of months to wait still. So these were the topics I wanted to talk about in relation to commercial practices at EU level, so thank you, and if you have questions, feel free.